Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The 1960s was a decade of radical transformation, turmoil, and progress that reshaped the United States in ways that continue to influence society today. It was a time of great conflict and great change, where movements for civil rights, gender equality, and anti-war sentiment clashed with traditional power structures. The Vietnam War dominated politics, dividing the nation between those who supported U.S. intervention and those who saw it as an unjust conflict. The civil rights movement reached its peak, with historic legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also faced intense resistance, violence, and tragic assassinations. The counterculture movement rejected mainstream values, embracing new ideas about freedom, self-expression, and social justice. Meanwhile, technological advancements, including the Apollo program, pushed the limits of human achievement, culminating in the moon landing of 1969, an event that symbolized both the optimism and the ambitions of the era. Yet, the decade was also marred by tragedy. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Robert Kennedy left the nation reeling, questioning its leadership and future. The 1960s was more than just a period of change. It was a turning point that challenged America's identity, values, and role on the world stage, shaping the nation for generations to come. Before the 1960s, segregation and Jim Crow laws enforced racial inequality across much of the United States, particularly in the South. Black Americans faced discrimination in schools, public places, employment, and voting rights. Despite the abolition of slavery, nearly a century earlier, systemic racism continued through policies designed to maintain white supremacy. However, the civil rights movement, which had been building since the early 20th century, gained unprecedented momentum in the 1960s. The decade saw a wave of direct action protests that challenged racial injustice. Sit-ins, where Black students peacefully occupied segregated lunch counters, began in 1960 and quickly spread nationwide, forcing businesses to integrate. The Freedom Rides of 1961 tested Supreme Court rulings that banned segregation in interstate travel. Black and white activists rode buses through the South, facing brutal violence from mobs and local authorities, yet their resilience drew national attention and federal intervention. In 1963, the movement reached a turning point with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where over 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to demand civil rights legislation. It was here that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, calling for an end to racism and envisioning a future of racial harmony. The march helped pressure President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which legally ended segregation in public places and banned discrimination in employment. Despite this major victory, voting rights for Black Americans remained restricted, especially in the South, where literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation prevented many from casting their ballots. The Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, met with violent resistance, highlighted these injustices, and led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed racial discrimination in voting. This marked one of the most significant legislative achievements of the movement. However, the struggle was far from over. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 devastated the movement, sparking riots across the country and symbolizing the deep racial divisions that remained. While legal segregation had ended, systemic racism and economic disparities persisted, fueling continued activism in the decades that followed. The victories of the civil rights movement laid the foundation for modern racial justice efforts, influencing subsequent movements like Black Lives Matter and ongoing fights for equality in education, employment, and criminal justice reform. The 1960s did not erase racial injustice, but it forced the nation to confront it, setting the stage for the continuing struggle for civil rights. As Cold War tensions escalated in the aftermath of World War II, the United States became increasingly involved in global conflicts to contain the spread of communism. Vietnam, a country long under French colonial rule, became a key battleground in this ideological struggle. By the mid-20th century, a strong nationalist and communist movement, led by Ho Chi Minh, emerged in Vietnam, seeking independence from foreign control. Ho, inspired by Marxist-Leninist principles, found support from the Soviet Union and China, while the United States saw his movement as part of a larger communist expansion threatening global stability. Following Japan's defeat in World War II, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence in 1945, citing the principles of self-determination from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. However, France, unwilling to relinquish its colonial grip, attempted to regain control, leading to the First Indochina War, 1946-1954, between French forces and the Viet Minh, Ho's communist-led army. The U.S., committed to stopping the spread of communism, funded up to 80% of France's war effort, fearing that a communist Vietnam would trigger a domino effect throughout Southeast Asia. The war culminated in 1954 with the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh defeated French forces, forcing France to withdraw. The subsequent Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's communist government controlling the north and a U.S.-backed government ruling the south, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The agreement called for national elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but fearing a likely communist victory, Diem, supported by the U.S., refused to hold them. Instead, he established a pro-Western regime, cracking down on communists and suppressing opposition. The U.S. justified its increasing support for South Vietnam through the domino theory, a Cold War belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in the region, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond, would follow, threatening American allies and interests. Throughout the 1950s, the U.S. provided military aid, advisors, and economic support to Diem's government, believing it could build a strong anti-communist state. However, Diem's authoritarian rule, religious persecution of Buddhists, and political repression led to widespread unrest, weakening his legitimacy and fueling support for the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, a communist insurgency in the South. By the early 1960s, the conflict escalated, and the U.S. increased its military presence under President John F. Kennedy, sending thousands of military advisors to train South Vietnamese forces. However, Diem's brutal policies and lack of popular support made stabilization difficult. In 1963, amid growing discontent, the U.S. quietly backed a coup by South Vietnamese generals that led to Diem's assassination. The political instability that followed deepened U.S. involvement, leading to full-scale military intervention under President Lyndon B. Johnson after the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. What began as an effort to contain communism through financial aid and military advisors soon transformed into a major war, with the U.S. deploying hundreds of thousands of troops by the mid-1960s. Over the next decade, the Vietnam War became one of the most divisive conflicts in U.S. history, shaping foreign policy, domestic politics, and the global Cold War struggle for ideological dominance. By the early 1960s, tensions escalated, and after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where the U.S. claimed North Vietnamese forces attacked American ships, President Lyndon B. Johnson dramatically increased U.S. involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave Johnson the power to send combat troops without an official declaration of war. Soon, hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers were deployed, and the war intensified with large-scale bombings, such as Operation Rolling Thunder. However, the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare tactics, dense jungle terrain, and unwavering resistance made victory elusive. As American casualties rose and the war dragged on, opposition within the U.S. exploded. By the late 1960s, the anti-war movement had become one of the most powerful protest movements in American history. College campuses became centers of dissent, with students organizing sit-ins, teach-ins, and massive demonstrations. Draft resistance increased, with thousands of young men burning draft cards or fleeing to Canada to avoid conscription. Major protests took place across the country, including the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where police violently clashed with demonstrators. The war's highly controversial nature was exacerbated by the rise of television coverage, making it the first war brought directly into American living rooms. Unlike previous wars, where the government controlled much of the narrative, graphic footage of bombings, civilian casualties, and body bags returning home fueled public outrage. One of the most shocking revelations was the My Lai Massacre, 1968, where where U.S. troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. As the public saw the brutal realities of war, trust in the U.S. government plummeted. The Kent State shooting in 1970, though occurring just after the 1960s, symbolized the climax of anti-war tensions. After President Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia, massive protests erupted. At Kent State University, the National Guard opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. This tragic event deepened national divisions and led to even greater public opposition to the war. By the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War had eroded trust in the government, divided the nation, and reshaped American politics and culture. What began as a fight against communism became a war that exposed the limits of U.S. military power and the dangers of unchecked political decisions. It remains one of the most controversial conflicts in American history, leaving lasting scars on both Vietnam and the United States. By the mid-1960s, a cultural rebellion against mainstream American values was in full swing. This counterculture revolution rejected the rigid norms of the 1950s, challenging everything from traditional gender roles to the U.S. government itself. At the heart of this movement were the hippies, young people who embraced peace, love, and personal freedom over war, materialism, and social conformity. Inspired by Eastern philosophy, environmentalism, and psychedelic experiences, the counterculture sparked one of the most radical social shifts in American history. Music became the anthem of the movement. Rock artists like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and Jimi Hendrix gave voice to the frustrations of young people. Dylan's protest songs like Blowin' in the Wind became anthems for civil rights and anti-war activists. The Beatles evolved from clean-cut pop stars into counterculture icons, incorporating psychedelic sounds and advocating for peace. In 1969, the legendary Woodstock Festival brought together 500,000 people in an unprecedented celebration of music, peace, and unity. Performances by Janis Joplin, The Who, and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young captured the spirit of a generation seeking freedom from societal constraints. At the same time, the counterculture was deeply tied to the sexual revolution and drug experimentation. The introduction of the birth control pill in the 1960s revolutionized women's autonomy over their bodies, leading to a more open conversation about sexuality. Figures like Timothy Leary, a former Harvard professor, promoted the use of LSD as a way to expand consciousness, coining the phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out. Psychedelic drugs, along with marijuana, became widely used among young people, seen as tools for breaking free from the restrictions of conventional society. The rise of communes and free love communities reflected a rejection of monogamy and the nuclear family model. However, the counterculture's influence wasn't just about personal liberation, it changed American society in lasting ways. The movement's emphasis on peace, civil rights, feminism, and environmentalism helped spark broader societal changes. Feminists and LGBTQ+ activists were inspired by the era's radical openness, leading to movements that pushed for equal rights. The emphasis on spirituality and holistic living paved the way for today's wellness industry, while progressive attitudes toward sexuality, music, and self-expression permanently altered Western culture. While the counterculture eventually faded in the 1970s as some turned to politics and others succumbed to disillusionment, its impact on today's world is undeniable. From the rise of modern activism to the continued influence of psychedelic music and fashion, the rebellious spirit of the 1960s remains a defining force in American history. By the 1960s, American society largely expected women to conform to traditional gender roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s reinforced these expectations, with suburban life, domesticity, and family values becoming dominant cultural ideals. While millions of women had entered the workforce during World War II, taking on roles in factories, offices, and other essential industries, many were forced back into the home once men returned from war. Government propaganda, societal norms, and media depictions in magazines, television, and advertisements all emphasized that a woman's primary role was to support her husband and raise children. However, as the 1960s progressed, dissatisfaction grew among women who felt constrained by these expectations. The reality was that many women, particularly those from working-class and minority communities, had always worked outside the home, often in low-paying, unstable jobs with few opportunities for advancement. Even middle-class women who pursued education and careers faced limited options, lower wages than men, and little room for professional growth. Many encountered the glass ceiling, an invisible barrier that prevented them from reaching leadership positions, while others were expected to leave the workforce after marriage or childbirth. A major catalyst for change came in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which exposed the widespread dissatisfaction and unspoken frustrations of housewives across America. Friedan coined the term, the problem that has no name, referring to the sense of emptiness many women felt despite living seemingly perfect lives. The book ignited a national conversation and helped launch the second wave of feminism, a movement that sought to address systemic inequalities in education, employment, reproductive rights, and legal protections. Women began demanding equal pay, workplace protections, and anti-discrimination laws. In 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was passed, making it illegal to discriminate based on gender, race, religion, or national origin in employment. However, enforcement was weak, and many employers continued to discriminate against women in hiring, promotions, and salaries. This led to the founding of the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966, with Betty Friedan as one of its leaders. NOW became a powerful voice in advocating for women's rights, fighting for workplace equality, legal reforms, and reproductive freedom. One of the most significant victories of the women's rights movement was the fight for reproductive rights. Until the late 1960s, birth control was difficult to access, and in some states, it was even illegal for married women. The FDA's approval of the birth control pill in 1960 gave women more control over their reproductive choices, allowing them to pursue careers and education without the fear of unplanned pregnancy. However, access to contraception remained controversial, and it wasn't until 1973 that the Supreme Court's ruling in Roe v. Wade established a woman's right to abortion, marking a major milestone in the fight for personal autonomy. The women's rights movement of the 1960s also pushed for changes in education and legal protections. The passage of Title IX in 1972 prohibited gender discrimination in schools and universities, opening doors for women in higher education and athletics. Additionally, laws such as the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, 1974, allowed women to obtain credit and loans without requiring a male cosigner, giving them more financial independence. Despite resistance from conservative groups and political opposition, the movement transformed American society, reshaping workplace policies, educational opportunities, and social expectations. Women in the 1970s and beyond would continue to fight for equal pay, protections against sexual harassment, and increased representation in leadership roles. The legacy of the women's rights movement of the 1960s remains deeply influential, as the fight for gender equality, workplace rights, and reproductive freedom continues today. One of the key turning points came in 1963, when journalist and activist Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. The book exposed the widespread frustration of many middle-class women who felt trapped in domestic life, unable to pursue careers or personal ambitions. Friedan called it the problem that has no name, highlighting how society discouraged women from seeking fulfillment beyond marriage and motherhood. The Feminine Mystique became a national bestseller and helped ignite a second wave of feminism, challenging the belief that a woman's place was solely in the home. That same year, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 was signed into law, making it illegal for employers to pay men and women different wages for the same work. While this was a significant legal step, enforcement was weak, and many women continued to experience wage discrimination. Recognizing the need for broader structural change, Friedan and other feminists founded the National Organization for Women, NOW in 1966, which became a powerful force in advocating for women's rights. NOW focused on issues like workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, and gender equality in education. The movement also laid the groundwork for Title IX, which would later be enacted in 1972. While not yet law in the 1960s, the decade's activism helped push for gender equality in education, leading to the eventual prohibition of sex-based discrimination in federally funded schools and sports programs. This was a game-changer for women's access to higher education and athletics. The women's rights movement of the 1960s paved the way for future battles over gender equality, including fights for reproductive rights, protections against sexual harassment, and greater female representation in politics and business. While the struggle for full equality continues today, the activism of the 1960s was a turning point that reshaped the role of women in American society, proving that they were more than just homemakers. They were leaders, professionals, and changemakers in their own right. The space race was one of the most intense and symbolic competitions of the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union battled for dominance in space exploration. This technological rivalry wasn't simply about scientific achievement. It was a high-stakes struggle to demonstrate the superiority of each nation's political ideology, economic system, and military capabilities. For both superpowers, space became a propaganda battlefield where success meant global prestige, national pride, and proof of technological and intellectual dominance. The space race began in earnest on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. This small, beeping metal sphere, no larger than a beach ball, marked the beginning of the space age and sent the U.S. into a panic. The launch of Sputnik suggested that the Soviet Union was technologically ahead of the United States, raising fears that they could develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of delivering nuclear warheads. In response, the U.S. government accelerated its own space efforts, leading to the creation of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in 1958. The Soviets continued to dominate the early years of space exploration. In April 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, solidifying Soviet leadership in space. His 108-minute flight aboard Vostok 1 was a monumental propaganda victory for the USSR, demonstrating their advanced rocket technology and putting enormous pressure on the United States to catch up. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy delivered a speech before Congress, challenging the U.S. to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This bold commitment launched Project Apollo, the most ambitious space program in history. Over the next several years, both nations made rapid advances. The Soviets achieved milestones like the first spacewalk, 1965, and the first unmanned spacecraft to reach the moon, Luna 2, 1959. Meanwhile, the U.S. intensified its efforts, sending astronauts into orbit through the Mercury and Gemini programs, perfecting techniques like space docking, extravehicular activity, and extended missions in microgravity, all necessary steps toward a moon landing. The defining moment of the space race came on July 20, 1969, when Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon. As millions watched on television, astronaut Neil Armstrong descended from the lunar module Eagle and became the first human to walk on the moon, uttering the famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The landing was a massive victory for the United States, fulfilling Kennedy's vision and marking a turning point in the space race. The U.S. had surpassed the Soviets, proving its technological and scientific capabilities on a global stage. Over the next few years, 6 more Apollo missions would send astronauts to the moon, further cementing American dominance in space exploration. By the early 1970s, the space race began to shift. The enormous costs of the Apollo program, combined with domestic challenges like the Vietnam War and economic struggles, led to a decline in public and political support for further moon missions. Meanwhile, U.S.-Soviet relations entered a period of détente, leading to cooperative space efforts such as the Apollo-Soyuz test project, 1975, the first international spaceflight mission, where an American Apollo spacecraft docked with a ICR Soviet Soyuz capsule. Though the intense Cold War rivalry faded, the space race paved the way for modern space exploration. It led to technological breakthroughs in rocketry, computing, and satellite communications, many of which still impact society today. The competition also laid the foundation for future international collaborations, including the International Space Station, ISS, and modern partnerships between nations in space exploration. Ultimately, the space race was not just about rockets and astronauts. It was a defining moment in history that demonstrated the power of human ambition, the drive for innovation, and the enduring quest to explore the unknown. The space race officially began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. This small metallic sphere, which emitted a simple radio signal as it orbited the Earth, sent shockwaves through the United States and the Western world. Many Americans saw Sputnik as proof that the Soviet Union was technologically superior, raising fears that the USSR could soon dominate space and even use it for military purposes, such as launching nuclear weapons from orbit. The U.S. government responded with urgency. In 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, leading to the creation of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. At the same time, the National Defense Education Act was signed into law, dramatically increasing funding for science, engineering, and mathematics education to develop a new generation of American scientists and engineers. The U.S. also accelerated its own space program, leading to the launch of Explorer 1, the first American satellite, in January 1958. The rivalry intensified in 1961, when the Soviets achieved another historic milestone, sending the first human into space. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth aboard Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961, cementing the Soviet Union's lead in the space race. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but it was a monumental Cold War victory for the USSR, proving that the Soviets had advanced ICE rocket technology capable of sending humans beyond Earth. In response, the United States made its own push to send astronauts into space. Less than a month after Gagarin's flight, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though his mission was a brief suborbital flight. A more significant breakthrough came on February 20, 1962, when John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth aboard Friendship 7. This successful mission boosted American confidence and demonstrated that the U.S. was catching up to Soviet achievements. Throughout the early 1960s, both nations continued their rapid advancements. The Soviets pioneered the first multi-person spacecraft and conducted the first spacewalk, EVA, in 1965, while the U.S. developed key spaceflight technologies through the Mercury and Gemini programs. These missions allowed American astronauts to practice crucial skills such as orbital maneuvers, space docking, and long-duration spaceflights, all of which would be essential for reaching the moon. As the space race escalated, President John F. Kennedy made a bold declaration. On May 25, 1961, he addressed Congress, challenging the U.S. to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. This goal became the driving force behind Project Apollo, a program that would ultimately lead to the historic moon landing in 1969, marking the U.S.'s greatest triumph in the space race. The ultimate goal, however, was the moon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy made his famous speech, declaring that the U.S. would land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade's end. This challenge set the stage for the Apollo program, which faced numerous setbacks but made continuous progress. Then, on July 20, 1969, the world watched in awe as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. Armstrong's words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," became an iconic statement of human achievement. Beyond the political and symbolic victory, the space race revolutionized technology. The need for lighter, more efficient computers for spacecraft led to the development of microchips, which later paved the way for modern personal computers and smartphones. Satellites, developed for space missions, transformed global communication, weather forecasting, and GPS technology. Even everyday items like memory foam, cordless tools, and water filtration systems were all byproducts of NASA's innovations. Perhaps most importantly, the space race inspired a new generation of scientists, engineers, and innovators. The BIA surge in STEM education and funding in the 1960s led to decades of technological breakthroughs, from the rise of Silicon Valley to the creation of the Internet. Even today, the legacy of the space race continues, influencing modern space exploration efforts by NASA, SpaceX, and other private companies aiming for Mars and beyond. Ultimately, the space race wasn't just about beating the Soviets. It reshaped human history, proving that with enough ambition, we could break barriers that once seemed impossible. The 1960s were marked by a wave of political assassinations that shook the United States to its core, altering the course of history and deeply affecting the national psyche. These killings not only robbed the nation of key leaders, but also fueled distrust in the government, sparked conspiracy theories, and changed the trajectory of social movements. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, remains one of the most shocking and controversial events in American history. As Kennedy's open-top limousine made its way through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, gunshots rang out. The president was fatally shot, and Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding with him, was also wounded. Within 30 minutes, Kennedy was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital, sending the nation into deep mourning. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine with connections to both the Soviet Union and Cuba, was arrested for the assassination. However, he never stood trial. 2 days later, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald on live television, fueling speculation that there was more to the story than the official explanation. The Warren Commission, tasked with investigating the assassination, concluded that Oswald acted alone, firing 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository. Despite this, many Americans remained unconvinced, and conspiracy theories quickly emerged. One of the main sources of doubt came from the infamous Zapruder film, a home movie that captured the assassination in graphic detail. Some believed the cheat footage suggested that shots came from multiple directions, possibly from the grassy knoll, contradicting the lone gunman theory. Others pointed to Oswald's background, questioning how a single individual with no known history of extreme violence could have pulled off such a crime without outside assistance. Several theories emerged, suggesting that Kennedy's death was the result of a larger conspiracy. Some believed the CIA was involved, possibly retaliating for Kennedy's attempts to limit their power after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Others suspected the mafia, given Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aggressive crackdown on organized crime. Some even speculated that the Soviet Union or Cuba had a role, especially considering Oswald's previous defection to the USSR and support for Fidel Castro. Regardless of the true circumstances, Kennedy's assassination shattered America's sense of security and trust in its government. The lingering doubts over the official story set the stage for widespread skepticism that would grow in the decades that followed, particularly during the Vietnam War, Watergate scandal, and other moments of political crisis. Even today, the assassination remains one of the most heavily debated historical events, with new theories, documents, and investigations continuing to emerge, keeping the mystery of JFK's death alive. The assassination of Malcolm X on February 21, 1965, further intensified racial and political tensions in America. A former member of the Nation of Islam who had become one of the most vocal and radical advocates for Black empowerment, Malcolm X had recently broken from the group and moderated his stance on race and integration. He was gunned down while giving a speech in New York City, allegedly by members of the Nation of Islam, though controversy remains about possible government involvement. His death marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, as some activists became more militant, embracing the Black Power movement in response to continued oppression. 3 years later, in April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. King, the most prominent leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement, was in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers when he was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. His death triggered riots in over 100 cities across the country, as many felt that nonviolent resistance had failed to protect their leaders. Though James Earl Ray was arrested for the crime, speculation persists that government agencies, particularly the FBI, were involved, given their history of surveillance and attempts to undermine King's work. Just 2 months after MLK's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, was also killed on June 5, 1968, after winning the California Democratic primary. As a senator, RFK had continued his brother's legacy, advocating for civil rights, ending poverty, and opposing the Vietnam War. His assassination by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian with grievances against RFK's support for Israel, dashed the hopes of many who believed he could unite a deeply divided country. The combined impact of these assassinations was profound. The civil rights movement became more fractured, with some turning to more radical approaches. The public lost faith in the government, believing it was either complicit in these deaths or incapable of protecting its leaders. This era gave rise to countless conspiracy theories that still persist today, questioning who truly held power in America. By the end of the decade, the optimism of the early 1960s had been replaced by cynicism, anger, and a deep sense of disillusionment. The deaths of JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and RFK left a void in American leadership, forever changing the political and social landscape of the United States. The legacy of the 1960s remains deeply embedded in modern America, as the decade's groundbreaking movements and defining moments reshaped the nation in profound ways. It was an era of social upheaval, political activism, and cultural transformation, with events that continue to influence civil rights, government policies, and societal values. Today, one of the most enduring impacts of the 1960s was the civil rights movement, which led to landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws outlawed racial segregation and secured voting rights for Black Americans, setting the stage for future battles for equality. The movement also laid the foundation for modern activism, inspiring later struggles for LGBTQ+ rights, women's rights, and immigrant rights. Politically, the decade saw a growing distrust in government, fueled by events such as the Vietnam War and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The anti-war movement, which mobilized millions of Americans, demonstrated the power of grassroots activism and public dissent. The skepticism toward government deepened in the following decades, influencing how Americans engaged with politics, protested injustices, and demanded transparency from their leaders. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, fueled by disillusionment with traditional values, challenged social norms related to gender, sexuality, and personal freedom. The era saw the rise of the hippie movement, anti-establishment attitudes, and artistic revolutions in music, film, and literature. The influence of 1960s counterculture can still be seen today in progressive social movements, the emphasis on individual expression, and ongoing debates over issues like drug policy and personal liberties. Another monumental achievement of the decade was the space race, culminating in the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. The success of the U.S. space program not only established American dominance in space exploration, but also inspired advancements in technology, engineering, and scientific research. The innovations developed during this time paved the way for modern space exploration, including missions to Mars, the International Space Station, and private sector spaceflight initiatives. The 1960s also revolutionized media and communication, as television became a dominant force in shaping public opinion. The way Americans consumed news, from civil rights protests to the horrors of the Vietnam War, set a precedent for modern-day media coverage, where visual storytelling and real-time reporting continue to shape political and social discourse. Ultimately, the 1960s redefined the American identity, laying the groundwork for the political, social, and cultural landscape of the 21st century. The decade's fights for equality, freedom, and innovation continue to resonate, proving that the struggles and triumphs of the era were not just historical moments, but catalysts for the ongoing evolution of American society. The most significant impact of the 1960s was the civil rights movement, which led to groundbreaking legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws outlawed racial discrimination and protected voting rights, fundamentally changing the legal and social fabric of the country. While racism and inequality still persist, the victories of the 1960s laid the foundation for future movements advocating for racial justice, such as Black Lives Matter and ongoing efforts for police reform. The decade also inspired other civil rights movements, including those for Latinos, Native Americans, LGBTQ+ communities, and people with disabilities. Politically, the 1960s radically shifted Americans' relationship with the government. Before this era, there was a general sense of trust in institutions, but the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and political assassinations shattered that faith. The Watergate scandal in the 1970s, which led to President Nixon's resignation, can be traced to the growing skepticism of government that took root in the 60s. The anti-war movement also set a precedent for mass political activism, influencing future protests against U.S. foreign interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Additionally, the feminist movement that gained traction in the 60s paved the way for later milestones like Roe v. Wade, 1973, Title IX, and the ongoing fight for gender equality in the workplace, and beyond. Culturally, the 1960s shattered traditional norms and ushered in a more open, progressive society. The counterculture movement challenged conservative values, promoting individual expression, artistic experimentation, and alternative lifestyles. The music of the era, led by artists like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Jimi Hendrix, not only defined a generation but also influenced decades of musical innovation. The period's emphasis on free speech, civil liberties, and questioning authority helped shape the progressive social movements of today, from LGBTQ's rights to environmental activism. The space race was another defining legacy of the 1960s, culminating in the 1969 moon landing. This historic achievement not only proved American technological superiority during the Cold War, but also laid the groundwork for modern advancements in satellites, computers, and global communication. The innovations of this era continue to impact industries such as aerospace, medicine, and artificial intelligence. The contrast between pre-1960s America and today is stark. Before this transformative decade, the country was largely segregated, socially conservative, and politically complacent. The 1960s broke down racial and gender barriers, encouraged political activism, and redefined cultural norms. Though many of the struggles from that era persist, the movements and changes it sparked continue to shape modern America. The decade remains a powerful symbol of resistance, progress, and the fight for a better future. The 1960s was a decade of unprecedented change, shaping America in ways that still resonate today. From the civil rights movement's fight for equality to the anti-war protests that redefined political activism, the country underwent a profound transformation. The counterculture movement challenged traditional norms, the women's rights movement laid the groundwork for gender equality, and the space race pushed technological advancements that continue to impact our daily lives. It was a time of both hope and turmoil, with landmark victories and devastating losses. But one thing is clear: the 1960s changed America forever. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think was the most important change of the 1960s? Was it the civil rights movement, the impact of the Vietnam War, the Cultural Revolution? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more history content. And if you want to see how the changes of the 60s shaped the next era, stay tuned for our next video on the turbulent 1970s.